at MIT. Prior to that was a postdoc at Stanford and then at Dartmouth. And most interestingly was a graduate of the University of Spoiled Children, otherwise known as Southern California. So that was that one. We were talking about that earlier on. And your dissertation, which is now a book, is Planning for the Short Haul, Explaining Wartime Trade Between Enemies, which seems somewhat apropos for the moment, but perhaps not. We will find out as we continue. So without further ado, I will pass on to you. Welcome to Brown.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and thank you for having me in person. This is a lot nicer than staring into a computer box. As I said, I'll try to be brief. I'm timing myself, so I can actually force myself to be brief. I'll skim through theory, skim through the empirics, and then focus on implications so that we can ultimately get to Ukraine.
You might want to be a little bit closer to yourself so that if anyone's watching, which we hope they are, on YouTube, hi everyone, then you can actually hear, but you should be able to hear and see the slides. There we go, we're good.
Okay. So, the topic today is trading with the enemy during war. I hope that's not a surprise. Conventional wisdom basically tells us that this should not be happening. If you trade with the enemy during the war, you're selling your opponent a gun with which they can shoot you, generally not something you want to be doing during a war. And there are several IR theories that are built on top of this assumption. So for example, the commercial piece, which tells us that because trade is so beneficial to states, they don't want to lose trade during the war, so they don't fight wars. Well, that not wanting to lose trade during the war is built on the assumption that during wars, two states do not trade with each other. The idea about security externalities also functions on the same idea that you don't want your enemies to keep getting the benefits from trade, so you channel your trade towards allies instead. But empirically, when we look out into the real world, we see that there's actually a lot of trade with the enemy happening during the wars. So there's a lot of variation in different wars. Some states choose to trade with their enemies during the war. Some states choose to trade for the beginning part of the war, but not for the later part of the war. And of course, there are some times when there is no trade with the enemy during war. But there's also variation across which products get traded during the war. So for example, two different belligerents in the same war can have different policies for the same product, as was the case in the Crimean War. Or the same belligerent in the same war can have different policies towards different products. That was in World War I. Or different belligerents can have different policies for the same product in different wars. So a lot of variation all around. And because variation is always great, there's also variation across time. So this is from the data set that I put together on the British wartime commercial policy in World War I. And just showing that different raw materials were prohibited at different points during the war. So this raises the question that if there's so much variation on wartime trade, how do we reconcile that with the fact that conventional wisdom tells us that none of this should be happening? So why do states trade with their enemies during the war? And my answer for this basically requires doing what most of you have probably been trained to do since the beginning of your studying, is that economic factors and security factors probably have to start talking to each other at some point. So I'm putting together IPE and military strategies together, and the answer is at the intersection of product characteristics and war expectations. So today, a little bit on definitions, because they are in fact very important. My theory of wartime trade, I'm going to give you some evidence from World War I, and then finally, the part that everyone's waiting for, we'll get to the implications. Unless the band interrupts us.
They'll be gone in a minute.
They're actually here for you.
I feel very welcome.
We thought we laid this on for all of our speakers. It's a surprise thing, but a good thing.
All right, perfect. Well, so trade with the enemy counts as any commercial dealing for the benefit of an enemy belligerent. That's the legal definition. What I draw from this, for my project, very important aspects, trading with the enemy can only happen during a war. So only enemy belligerents can be involved in wartime trade. If a neutral state chooses to profiteer from this, it doesn't count as wartime trade. I also look at trading with the enemy from the legal point of view, so I'm not focusing on all of the stuff that firms do above the legal prohibitions. I'm trying to solve the puzzle specifically of why would a state allow its merchants to trade with the enemy during the war, so making it a hard case. And Something I'm calling wartime commercial policy is every decision that the state puts together about which products are and are not allowed to be traded during the war. All of that altogether is the wartime commercial policy of the state. And the theory basically explains how a state would create that, which I conceptualized as a way of balancing competing incentives. So from the military point of view, the gains from trade can be channeled into military capabilities. So purely on military incentives, we should sever all trade. On the other hand, if we look at economic incentives, then trade is beneficial. You're getting both products and increased productivity from trade. You don't want to give up those gains even during the war. So we should keep all trade during the war. And a wartime commercial policy needs to somehow balance between these two incentives, which requires minimizing the security costs of trade and at the same time maximizing the economic benefits of trade, for which I argue we need two theoretical interventions. The first, security externalities are not instantaneous, so it takes time to convert the gains from trade into military capabilities, and that time gives us some room to trade with the enemy. And second, not all products are equally important to the economy of the state, which means that there are some products that we can actually give up during war in order to make sure that our security is supported, which gives us enough room for a wartime commercial policy to exist. So to go into that in a bit more detail. On the time aspect, I'm calling this variable conversion time. Basic idea is how long does it take to go from the gains from trade into military capabilities. It's a function of these four processes. Transportation refers to how long does it take to take a product from wherever you bought it to, in the shortest case, to the battlefield. Or how long does it take to take a product to a factory where it will then be produced into something else. So the amount of time it takes to convert a raw material into intermediate good into a finished product which can then be used on the battlefield. Transaction time refers to the amount of time it takes to make a deal, especially if in war you're switching suppliers, you're trying to find ways to diversify, how long it takes to actually structure those deals. And finally, since most of the time it's firms that trade, but states that need to extract the gains from trade, taxation time also adds an extra element to it because states either need to expropriate their merchants or tax their merchants in order to benefit from trade and channel those gains into military capabilities. So overall, the shorter the enemy's conversion time for a specific product, the less likely the state is to allow trade in that product during the war. And conversely, the longer the conversion time, the more likely the state is to allow trade in that particular product. On the flip side, we can look at how much revenue a state will lose if trade in a particular product is severed. And again, I'm focusing on loss here because it makes it conceptually a little bit easier. The reason economic factors matter here is that any interruption to the stream of revenue of a state will impact their future security, or how much money they can funnel into making sure that their military capabilities, their grand strategies, their military plans are all set, and they can not only prosecute this specific war, but be able to fight the next war afterwards. So losing a lot of money today might be able to help you fight the current war, but it will prevent you from being prepared for the next war, leading to a Pyrrhic victory. The most important aspect of this, in my mind, is if a specific product has easy substitutes or a very easy way of switching to an alternative supplier, then you don't necessarily lose much of revenue from trade. You just have to pay the switching costs, but other than that, your industries can still keep producing the products that you're ultimately using. But from everything else, the amount of money that the state will lose from if they give up trade is a function of the number of points at which that product can be taxed as it comes into the country and as it circulates in the domestic economy. So if a raw material is imported from abroad, you can tax it when it comes into the country. As it's being produced, you can tax the manufacturing process, and if it's then exported or sold domestically, you can plausibly put a sales tax on it, all of which will allow states to benefit. And for a given product, the greater the state's loss of revenue from severing trade, the more likely the state is to allow trade during the war. And we can put these two dimensions together to get a very nifty estimation of which products are more or less likely to be traded during the war. So the bottom dimension here is conversion time. This dimension here is the loss of revenue for the state. If we focus on the data point currently labeled gun, the assumption being it takes a fairly short amount of time for an enemy to convert the gun into military capabilities because all they have to do is bring it to the battlefield, which, unless you're Russia, is a pretty short process. On the loss of revenue, so this was on the assumption of British World War I. The gun industry was not particularly important to their comparative advantage at that time, but also if they were to lose foreign trade in guns, they had a pretty big domestic market opening up because they had their own demand from the war, so there wouldn't be too much loss there. So guns are much more likely to be prohibited. On the other hand, as you move out, products that take a long time to be converted can be less likely to be prohibited, and products that generate a lot of revenue are more likely to be protected by the state, so also less likely to be prohibited. But this alone, in my mind, is not enough, because this only tells me what is more or less likely to be prohibited in general. But in a specific war, what do you do with steel? It's just hanging precisely in the middle of this graph. Do you prohibit it? Do you not? For that, I argue, you need to look at the war level. You need to figure out what the decision makers expect about the coming war. And here, two dimensions matter specifically. The length of the war, with the idea being if you expect a particularly long war, then your opponent has a long time to convert gains from trade into military capabilities. But if you're expecting a short war, then your opponent doesn't have very much time to convert trade, therefore much more trade can be allowed. The other dimension that I'm using as a threshold is the intensity of the war, idea being existential struggle versus a foreign policy dispute somewhere on your periphery. The more existential the war is, the more you're willing to give up trade in order to focus on current survival as opposed to future security. Sorry, yeah, no, that's right. So this is the same graph that I had before, same distribution of products, same dimensions, but what I'm doing is I'm overlapping the war characteristics on top of the product characteristics. So if the conversion time of a particular product is longer than the expected duration of the war, a state can trade in this particular product during the war because it will not help the enemy win on the battlefield. And if we add the other dimension, if a particular product, if losing trade in a particular product will cause so much harm to the economy that the state will not be able to ensure its long-term security, then a state will protect it even if it gives an advantage to the enemy in the current war. So everything inside the box then is prohibited for trade, and this allows a state to set its wartime commercial policy. And the reason I like putting things in this graph form is because it allows me to see how the policy would change over time. Because the expectation of the length of war can change during the war. In fact, during World War I, it changed very often. But if the length of the war is all of a sudden expected to be longer, then you know that there's another set of products that now need to be prohibited from trading with the enemy, which explains why the wartime commercial policy changes over time. At the same time, if the intensity of the war changes and the war becomes more existentially threatening, same story, the state now knows what products need to be given up. All right, and I'll speed up going through the evidence so that we can get to the implications. So this is the British wartime commercial policy in World War I. This is the number of products that were prohibited from export to the enemy from the beginning of the war to 1917, because after that the variation becomes a lot less interesting to look at. So we can compare this to the conventional wisdom, which just tells us that we shouldn't see any wartime trade, so should have been a straight line. Clearly that's not what's happening. We can also compare this to a Schelling-esque policy of just slow escalation to increase pressure on the enemy. And it sort of looks like that's what's going on, except for the increases and the valleys on the actual wartime commercial policy are not accidental. If we overlay the expectations of the length of the war with the shaded columns here representing expectations of a long war, and the non-blanked out columns, the white ones, showing expectations of a short war, we can see that actually when a state expects a long war, they prohibit a lot more products than in periods when they're expecting the war to finish up, and at that point they prohibit less products. So I'd like to talk about the initial process of formulating this wartime commercial policy first. So Britain was very helpful in this respect. They actually formed a subcommittee called the Subcommittee on Trading with the Enemy, because they actually decided to think through this process and decide what they want to do. And this committee requested 2 pieces of information from the Board of Trade and from their general staff, which was, as expected, well, what does their economic relationship with Germany actually look like, and what kind of war are we expecting here? So on the first, I won't go too much into this, but the general assessment that they got from the Board of Trade was that Germany is the primary supplier for 44% of the goods that the United Kingdom imports, and the United Kingdom can't really source those products in a large enough quantity from anywhere else. So they decided that we are nearly as dependent on Germany for our imports as she is on us for her exports. So at least in one direction, they thought that this trade was pretty significant for them. However, on the flip side, they said, well, Germany is a primary buyer for 17% of our products, so we are using Germany as a pretty big market. This is kind of important for us, but if necessary, we can sacrifice this trade without doing too much damage to our own economy and to our own profits. On the second question, they asked their general staff what kind of war they're expecting. They got this in return, and the actual document they got was about 2 sentences longer than this, so this really was the extent of the information they got. It would not be safe to calculate on the war lasting less than 6 months. The way they interpreted this as, the general staff doesn't want to give us a point prediction because they know we're going to blame them if they're wrong, but they also knew that the general staff at the same time was negotiating for the level of stockpiles in their country. So it was actually in the interest of the military to claim the war was going to be longer than their expectations, so they can have higher stockpiles in the country. So they assumed that, great, the war is going to last 6 months, this is going to be a short war. In their actual discussions, all sorts of ideas were discussed. Some people initially supported complete cutoff trade with the enemy. The Treasury, unsurprisingly, supported complete trading with the enemy, no limitations on anything whatsoever, business as normal. And after a lot of discussions, they came to at least a few points of agreement. So first, they agreed that the commercial policy needs to fit the specific war that they're fighting. Right, so it is, of course, utterly impossible to foresee what developments of the policy to be adopted may become necessary during the course of a protracted war. Probably all that can be done now is to consider the most suitable policy for the adoption at the outset of the war. So it comes from a recognition that a long war will have one type of policy, a short war will have a very different type of policy. And they also recognize that the economic pressure that they're planning for is, in fact, time-dependent. If the war were brought to a rapid conclusion by the success of the German armies over France, it was framed that way because they didn't have a very high opinion of France at the time, shocker, it would not be worthwhile for us to exercise the weapon of economic pressure, which must necessarily require time to produce effect. With the idea being reversed that if England finishes the war very quickly, economic pressure would also not have time to produce an effect. The other thing that they agreed on, talking in generalities at this particular planning point, is that different products should probably be treated differently. And they came up with 3 different categories: arms, ammunition, naval, and military stores, or in my lingo, things that have a very quick conversion time into military capabilities, they considered to be too dangerous to trade with the enemy. Raw materials and food was a very interesting discussion, which I'll get to. Innocent goods were things that are products that need to be manufactured and used for civilian consumption. So in my lingo, products that have a long conversion time. They deemed these by the name innocent, as in safe for trading with the enemy, because again, they were expecting a particularly short war. On raw materials and food, there was a lot of discussion because they were trying to figure out what's more important, that Germany is going to make a lot of money from this because raw materials were important for the German economy, or is it more important the fact that if Germany makes this money, they won't be able to use it because it'll take a while for Germans to make this money because the conversion processes take a long time. And the final policy basically shows that they went with conversion time is the thing that matters when you're looking at the enemies, because they decided that raw materials and food can in fact be traded with the enemy. So at the start of the war, the British wartime commercial policy was fairly lax. They said, except for 147 products which were designated as arms and ammunition and basically anything that can go boom, you're allowed to trade with the enemy. Indirectly, because direct trade with the enemy is very difficult, because when your ships are going towards enemy ports, enemy tends to shoot at them even if they're commercial, because again, you're at war. There's some limitations of what you can do. All right. And at the same time, they made trade even easier by granting certain merchants licenses on importing goods from Germany directly, specifically goods which are essential for the maintenance and development of industries in this country and cannot be supplied to anything approaching an adequate extent from other than enemy sources. So in my lingo, products the loss of which will cause a lot of damage to our economy, we're going to import from the enemy regardless from the fact that this is war. So I'm actually going to skip over the policy changes because they mostly conform to theory anyway, to show you what the general distribution of products actually look like. So this is a cut of 2 years apart of what was actually being prohibited from trade from the British point of view. So we start with things that are your usual suspects. Again, this is things that are immediately military capability increasing. Fast forward 2 years, you have some raw materials, you have products that can be used to make something that could plausibly be used for war. Fast forward another 2 years, and now we're 4 years into the war. We're prohibiting tins, empty, wholly or partly made of iron and steel sheet or plate, bakery utensils. I'm almost 100% convinced that they were not concerned about Germans' ability to cook. They were more concerned about their ability to actually use, remelt these products, use the raw materials for alternate production. So again, things that would increase the conversion process because you'd have to extract them from something else. We can also see that the prohibitions were very responsive to what was happening on the battlefield. So November 10th, 1914, this is about when the race to the sea has ended, the two armies are stalled, they're starting to dig trenches. Britain prohibits the export of anything that can be used in Germany to build those trenches. My favorite example, machine guns were allowed to be exported until 1915. The general idea here is everyone expected that machine guns were only used in stationary warfare, that they had very little utility in mobile warfare. So actually, carriages and anything that attaches wheels to machine guns were prohibited on day one. Machine guns, not so much. But when the war actually became a trench warfare, and they realized that machine guns can be used in war, then they were prohibited. When Germans started using poison gas, and they quickly figured out which poison gas were being used, those became prohibited. We can also see that the supply chain and conversion time play a role in these prohibitions. So going down in when things were being prohibited, at the very start of the war, harnesses that can be used for military purposes. A couple of months later, leather that can be used to make those harnesses. Fast forward almost a year, metal fittings for harnesses that can be used for military purposes. So this is, the leather was used to repair the harnesses. This was actually used to make new harnesses. And then fast forward several years, well, now we're hitting machines that could be used in the production process to manufacture these. And these kinds of supply chain prohibitions, temporal prohibitions, can be, oh no, okay, I'm not sure what happened down there, but I can explain what's going on. Can be summarized in general throughout the entire data set. So finished goods are in general prohibited earlier during the war. Finished goods, intermediate goods, raw materials, and substitute goods. So by substitute goods, I mean things like the bakery utensils that have some tin in them. So things that are not meant to be used for their initial purpose, but from which you can extract some materials to then make something that could plausibly become a military capability. All right, so the part everyone here is actually to come here to hear. Where I'd like to start is, I know I gave you an example from World War I, the global economy has been changing. How does this actually affect the theory? Unfortunately, I think it tells us that there's going to be a lot more trading with the enemy going forward than there was even in World War I, which is surprising given that World War I saw a lot of trading with the enemy. But where I'm coming from is we have now a lot of trade that is happening through multinational corporations, which is linking countries much closer together in such a way that we have just-in-time production and we have product diversification so that switching to alternate production sources becomes more difficult. This means that countries are much more likely to worry about keeping existing trade and basically going to be paying higher switching costs to alternate possible trading sources, which means that on the scale of loss of revenue from losing trade, products are going to be shifted higher up from when they were before. At the same time, we also know that the global supply chain means that about 50% of exports nowadays are intermediate goods, which means that a lot of our trade is happening in products that have longer conversion times. Finished goods having shorter conversion times, raw materials longer, and intermediate goods somewhere in the middle, which means that a lot of trade is happening in things that would shift all of the dots on the plot in that direction, which means we should be able to fight longer wars before the prohibition on trade should hit. And at the same time, all of our wars are getting shorter. So if you put those two things together, I'm expecting a lot more wartime trade. Oh, okay. So security competition short of war. I am of the opinion that the theory as I presented to you cannot actually be applied outside of the war context. Specifically, the trade-offs that I'm describing are you actually need a war for them to work. Because war acts as a focusing mechanism that allows me to take a lot of factors that would be influencing a commercial policy out of the equation. It can very much be a question of how does every economic aspect affect the battlefield, and we have to have a very strict economy security trade-off. In peacetime, that's just not the case. You have domestic politics, which plays a much larger role, and you can't have the same very simple calculation. But at the same time, in wartime, belligerents have belligerent rights. They have a lot more tools for preventing trade from going where they need it to go. They can blockade a state. They can do a lot of stuff preventing exports from leaving the country. If you try to use any of these tools in peacetime, that's a very high escalatory risk because most of these things will get you into war. So I don't think the theory itself works in peacetime, but the general trade-off between economic and security factors can still be considered in situations short of war. So outside of war, the main factor of why you don't want to be trading with the enemy, or I guess it's not really an enemy at that point, it's more like the adversary. The reason you don't want to be trading with the adversary is because of this concept of leverage. You don't want them to prevent you from getting the materials that you need in war precisely when you're about to start a crisis. Well, unfortunately, I don't actually think, given the factors I described, given the global economy, that there is going to be much leverage that can be drawn, at least in modern conflicts, because we are trading mostly in products that take long conversion times. So if we're expecting a fairly short crisis situation, not a prolonged thing, and most crises, especially involving great powers and the potential for nuclear escalation, tend to be fairly short, basically means that there's not much leverage that can be gained from trade. If there's not much leverage that can be gained from trade, then severing trade doesn't bring a lot of military utility to the state. But at the same time, it still comes with opportunity costs, because if you sever trade with an opponent and all of the other third parties in the world don't, well, now you're losing not only yourself from losing out the trade, but you're also losing relative to those third parties. So using these sorts of concepts outside of the war basically tells us that using economic tools to attempt to affect your enemies are high-cost, low-benefit situations, so possibly not going to work. And this, of course, affects the situation in Ukraine, why I think that most economic sanctions would not be able to affect foreign policy change. What is going on here? Okay. Finally, one other implication I see is to the idea of decoupling. And this stems from implications about how relative gains are calculated. So a lot of the conversation about the United States and China decoupling their economies, we want to prevent ourselves from being leveraged by China. We also want to prevent ourselves from helping China grow because it's using the gains from trade to be more assertive and to coerce its neighbors. That's the rhetoric we're hearing, and it's entirely based on the idea that if we sever, completely decouple from the Chinese economy, based on dollar value of hurt imposed, China will be hurt more than the United States. But that excludes aspects of time from the calculation. So the question is, who will be hurt first? And the reason this matters is because in the United States, at least, a policy of decoupling needs to be politically sustainable for politicians to actually go for it. At the same time, we have a free market versus a semi-command economy. In a command economy, it's a lot easier to use different tools to control the economy, to disperse pain in such a way as to decrease its effects, at least in the short term. You can't do that in a market economy, which means that it's very likely that the United States will feel the pain from this decoupling before China will. And then politicians are left in a situation where they have to sell to their constituents that we're not hurting them, we're being hurt, and yet somehow this is a good idea. And I just don't think that that's politically sustainable. All right. Really? And then the final implication is the most obvious one, so I don't have to spend too much time on it, but on the commercial piece, it very much relies on the assumption that states don't trade during the war because they don't want to lose the benefits of the trade, they don't fight. Well, if you can trade during the war, and given that in the current economy, I'm thinking that wartime trade is going to be very likely, then trade cannot actually serve as a deterrent to war for us. So basically, I'm stuck in a situation where I'm arguing that most of our economic levers that are meant to provide any military payoffs are not working to provide any military payoffs. And on that bright note, I shall end. So, thank you very much.
Who wants to begin? Go on, Pia.
Hi. Really fascinating material, great topic. I think we met once before, right? Yeah. So a couple questions about, I'm trying to figure out the scope conditions of the project. One would be, are you restricting it to interstate war? So I want to unpack war, interstate war, and if that's so, then that's an important move. And second of all, unpack trade, because it sounds like you are strictly looking at legal trade. Because if it's prohibited, then it's bracketed, that's not happening. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out what happens to the analysis if there's substantial amounts of informal trade between enemies, and if it's less traditional war, civil wars, insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, because, I just think of the American Civil War, massive amount of cotton trade from south to north, but totally illegal, but tolerated because it helped northern cotton mills, and the South was definitely, that was their war money, was cotton. Or you think of the War of 1812, part of the reason it was a stalemate was because there was massive amount of trading with the enemy, but totally illegal. So how does that fit into your analysis? And I'm sure somebody's going to ask you about Ukraine, but I'll resist because buying all that Russian energy, I'm wondering how that implies.
It's coming. But thank you. Very good point. I generally go through the scope conditions, but I was trying to cut that out. It's a wrong thing to cut out. Fair point. I think as far as wars, this would apply to interstate wars, but also civil wars on the caveat that territory is controlled by an actor that can set a wartime commercial policy for that territory. So not interspersed civil wars, not civil wars where control of a territory changes daily, because if there is no legal wartime commercial policy, then none of these decisions are structured in this particular way. But civil wars where territory is controlled by an actor, I don't think it matters if it's a state or a non-state organization or anything of the sort. Basically, all I need is a territory for which a political organization can set a wartime commercial policy. As far as trade is concerned, I am looking at only legal trade because the question that I find interesting is why would a state permit this to actually happen? So ignoring all of the stuff that's happening outside of it, sort of looking at the trade-off between the economic and the security goals for that particular state. So in the cases that you brought up, I am ignoring the informal trade because I think different mechanisms would be explaining it, not these. But the Civil War is very interesting. I've found evidence that the South actually legally allowed some of the trade. I can't find any evidence if the North legally or made it legal at any point. I'm assuming it was mostly legal through most of the time. So technically speaking, it would only the theory would only apply to the South's calculations, not to the North's. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I mean, I'm just wondering, if you just tell the story of the American Civil War through your lens, I think it might be accurate, but then you miss so much of the action, right? Because, for example, you said you're only looking at trade that's tolerated by the state. Well, the state tolerated the illicit trade, but you're defining illicit trade as not tolerated, right? So it's, yeah, and for the South, of course, they're perfectly happy selling cotton to anybody because that's their war money. But it's the real puzzle is the North basically buying it because they know it's contributing to the South's war effort. Anyway, we can talk
Yeah,
more.
no, I agree. It's a fascinating puzzle. It's just a slightly different puzzle than this one. So I would expect that I'd need a different theory to explain it.
Jan?
Yeah, really great talk. I was interested in, so you look at Britain. Britain exports mainly finished or some kind of manufacturing goods. Can your theory also explain raw material exports? So someone like Russia, do you have material on that?
Yeah.
Is this kind of the same calculation?
Absolutely. So actually Britain had, right, so it wasn't just raw materials that Britain was exporting. They were trading across all levels. They had raw materials, intermediate goods, finished goods, across, so everything. So, and this can explain just any product in itself. And I'm actually leveraging the difference in products, sort of where they are in the supply chain, for the conversion time variable. So the idea being that raw materials take a long time to be converted, so their production times would be longer, so they should have longer conversion times. Finished goods ideally are already finished when they're sold to you, so they should have shorter conversion times into military capabilities, so less likely to be traded.
But if I can jump in there for a second, you
Yeah.
need to eat, so you need wheat. It's a very short conversion time. You
Yes.
need to run a tank, you need oil. It's a pretty short conversion time. So
Absolutely.
wouldn't you expect those to be the first things that you would prohibit?
Right, fair point. Conditional on supply chain, right? So within the same supply chain, the raw material should have a longer time than the finished good. But across the supply chains, it's would be very different. And I don't have the graph with me, but I have, my bad, a set of chains of when different products were being prohibited during the war for Britain in World War I. And at the very beginning of the war, you have certain finished goods that are being prohibited, certain intermediate goods are being prohibited, and certain raw materials are being prohibited because they're part of a very short supply chain. So wheat and stuff like that.
Right, makes sense. Tony?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to ask my question in a lazy sort of way, which is to say, as I understand the empirical situation now, you have Russia transshipping gas and oil through pipelines in Ukraine to Europe. And the conversion times for the use of those are very short. I don't know whether Russia is still paying Ukraine the shipment fees, but I suspect they are.
And they're still supplying Ukraine with the gas.
And they're still supplying Ukraine with the gas. And so then the question is, do you expect, one is, why don't the Ukrainians blow this stuff up, right?
Because they want European weapons.
Because they want European, right? But if the thing dragged on long enough, you might think that, and the other one, how does that fit into this? In other words, what would
Right, so there is the added calculation that technically speaking, Ukraine does not buy it directly from Russia. They buy it from a European intermediary that buys it from the pipeline that goes through through Ukrainian territory. And this was an artifact of the Crimean annexation, basically involving the European intermediary to prevent Russia from doing funky stuff with the prices that Ukrainians have to pay for the gas. So because of the way that it's set up, for Russia to cut off gas to Ukraine, it would also have to hit the European intermediaries as well. So yes, so third parties are integral to the entire story. I don't emphasize them as much when I present the theory, but half of the effects here are driven by fear of losing to third parties. Right? You don't want to give up market share, because if you do, somebody else can come in and sell those products to your enemy, and that's one of the major reasons why losing trade is problematic for states, and why they want to keep it even during the war.
So, does this mean that like Russia should stop the war because they don't want to lose like Germany, like my country, to like buy their gas?
Will it lose it? Will it lose Germany? Will Germany stop buying Russian gas?
Just a minute, committed to like, I think in mid-24 we are not buying any Russian gas. Whether this is true or not.
Here's the thing, they said the same thing after the Russia annexed Ukraine, and they're still buying Russian oil. I think Russia is making the calculation that they're just not gonna pull the trigger.
All right, but then if we like go into like a decoupling world, right? And it looks like that we're going to this world now. I'm not sure if we are, that would be really bad for Russia, and that would basically mean that the theory then kind of stops at that point, at least for Russia. Right? And but just like the second, then just like, so even like the Russians selling us once oil and gas, it's great. We're giving them dollars, but then they can't do anything with their dollars. So what happens then?
That's
the
not the...
Russians basically saying,
You're assuming the sanctions work. The ruble's back up to 89% of its pre-invasion value, which means that people are buying rubles and using rubles.
but is this because the companies like Gazprom, they have to like convert dollars into like 80%?
Yes, it is because of government policies, but it's still working. But sort of to your question, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this recently, of what happens if Europe does actually decouple from Russia. And the thing that I keep coming up against is that the energy markets are very saturated, and we're basically producing as much supply as there is demand, and Russia is a very big supplier. So if Europe stops buying Russian gas, it'll have to buy it somewhere from the global supply, which means there's going to be a hole somewhere for Russia to sell to. So the response will be a redistribution of who buys from whom, but I don't think Russia will be in a situation where it's stuck with gas that no one wants.
Okay, that's a good point actually.
I kept bumping up against this, and I can't find a way out. Yes?
So I just want to continue on this for a second. So, but not with a specific example, I want to try to generalize. So, I read your IS paper before, and something that struck me was it was a very dyadic story for a topic that seems like global, like trade that seems global, right? And so, I study arms transfers, and you see a lot of states selling arms to adversaries, and you even see enemies trading arms in war. And the reason is because basically, if I don't sell them, someone else will, right? So you sort of hinted at this at various times in your talk. Is there's this key challenge, which is I don't want to lose market share. Like, they're going to get the good from somewhere else, so it might as well be me that sells it. So it seems to me that should dominate the logic. Like, if we're in a world where there's a global market and the market is like highly competitive, then we should see no trade restrictions, because you're gonna sell somewhere else and they're gonna buy from somewhere else. So that suggests that there's like a scope condition or something that this is a story about. You're looking at goods where that's not the case. Like there are goods where the U.S. makes better fighter jets than anyone else. So we're not selling fighter jets to our adversaries. But, you know, a bullet's a bullet, so we might as well sell them because we want the money. So, so I wonder if there's sort of like, when you're looking at the goods that your story is talking about, like for the first question in a sense is like, is this good, is the market for this good, I forget my IP classes, so I'm using the wrong terms, but
Inelastic.
is the market, is it globalized, is it competitive or monopolistic or whatever, and that can sort of scope to the kinds of goods that your story is going to have more explanatory power on.
So I see where you're going with this, but I don't buy the initial premise. So yes, the economic factors matter a lot, and part of the book project is actually tracing the development of neutral rights of when third parties became more important than they ever were before, and when trading with the enemy actually became a problem for states. But we can't forget the war aspect of this, because supplying your enemy with products is a very dangerous thing to do. And if your survival is on the line, the fact that if I give my opponent a gun today and they will be able to get it from somewhere else only in 10 days, that could mean life or death for you. So because of those differences too, the military and the security aspects have to be important to the story, and every economic decision still has to be funneled through what will it do to my battlefield outcomes. So yes, you can lose a lot of market share and you can have a lot of economic damage that comes to you from not trading with your enemy during the war, but survival has to come first.
Can I just
Yeah, of course.
respond? I mean, so certainly, like, if you have established trade lines and you have things in transit or whatever, you have some leverage to, like, impose a delay where they can't get the same thing from someone else. But on day one of the war, if, you know, the adversary comes to me and says, we'd like to sign a contract with you to buy a gun that you'll deliver in 4 months, let's say that's within the time frame of how long we think the war is going to be, or we're going to go to this neutral country next door and buy them from them, like, do you want to sell them to us? They're going to get them on the same day at the same price conceivably, so I'm going to sell them to them. Right?
As you absolutely should, given this theory.
But it's inside the expected length of war. The war is going to be a year. I want delivery in 4 months.
Oh, I see. In that case, I misunderstood.
I'm saying, like, your response was, yeah, if I can constrain them 9 days from getting the gun, then I'm going to do that.
Yes.
But if I'm selling, if we're doing trade where, like, they're putting in orders and the delivery is a month out, and they could order it from someone else a month out too.
Ah, okay. So that's the point where I'd intervene. In war, because belligerent rights are pretty extensive, I can prevent someone else from delivering goods to you. I can quite literally bomb every single airplane that's driving to you. I can bomb every single train and every single truck that approaches your borders. Products that I give you, I know you will get. I can prevent you from getting products easily from somewhere else. So it's not exactly a one-to-one conversion.
So do we see states restricting trade from neutrals in your gray box?
All the time, absolutely, yes. So in fact,
That seems like an important part of the story.
It is, but there's only so much I can put into one presentation. No, you're absolutely right, but Britain's first move on any war they've ever fought is blockade every single port that the country has, and that in many ways prevents a lot of neutrals from trading with the other state as well. Yes?
So I find it really fascinating. I'm just like, does this only work with the United States or no? And even it doesn't always work with Britain. Like during World War I, the Americans were like, absolutely furious that they couldn't sell their cotton to the Germans. And the British were so concerned that if they would blockade cotton trade or other American products, they would be at war with the United States.
Mm-hmm.
It was, and this then led to kind of arms control agreements after the war and kind of so like in what kind of world do these sanctions or blockades or third party neutral parties actually work?
Well, I'm not sure I'm understanding the question exactly. So what do you mean, what kinds of word would the blockades work?
So like, if you have to be powerful enough to like
Yeah.
impose trade restriction on third parties,
Right.
and I guess this works during the Cold War, right? When there's United States, it's a bipolar world, but if you're in a multipolar world, even like, you know, in
I see.
World War I, that's much more difficult actually, right? And it also depends on, like,
Yep.
if you look at like World War II, Britain, like Germany didn't even trade with anyone anymore, basically, right? Just Russia, like, I mean, in that context it also works, but like,
I see.
in another kind, like, you know, kind of like another kind of work, both in the way that the economy is structured, but also like the distribution of power, it really is important.
In fact, it didn't actually even work during the Cold War. Most of the United States allies abandoned it pretty quickly and said, well, Japan's trading with Russia, so we as Europe want to trade with Russia as well because we don't want to be losing out to the Japanese, because economic logic kicks in. But so in wartime, this is a little bit easier because if your state has a navy, you can blockade enemy ports. That still leaves a lot of the land border open, and that requires either allies or an active military force that's willing to bomb trade routes, which then we get into iffy questions of what exactly counts as laws of war and war crime, and I want to avoid that discussion for the time being. In peacetime, this is really difficult because you don't have any of the belligerent toolbox of use to you, but allies. Well, either you manage to somehow create a situation where the target of your sanctions is dependent on you, which is almost impossible because most states try to diversify away from that situation, even in individual products, though somehow that becomes difficult. So every once in a while you can have a specific product that's only being produced in one location, and then you can sort of use that product as leverage. But it's a question of how much leverage you can get from that one product. But other than that, unless you can get everyone who trades with the target of your sanctions on board, there's always going to be someone who is functioning as the very profitable third party that benefits from low selling prices and high buying prices.
Awesome.
Yeah, quick question on the revenue axis of this graph here. I can tell how your empirics make sense in terms of this theory. But from a military strategy perspective, there's something that's doesn't quite make sense to me for two reasons that you mentioned later in the presentation, but I'm curious if you could relate it back to this revenue axis. And one is, shouldn't it, rather than pure revenue, be the exposure or fragility of this revenue to the enemy? If you can easily substitute the enemy and sell it to someone else, it doesn't really matter how high the revenue is, it's how vulnerable it is. And the other one is the relative gain from it. It might be a small gain for you to trade, but you might be selling a factor that is critical for the economy of the enemy. You've mentioned actually both of these and also in the discussion we just had. But that doesn't then fit with this theory, no? Would the British disagree with these two arguments? And why didn't they make decisions according to that? Because if they agreed, they would have made decisions differently, as far as I can tell.
So on the first question, the exposure to the enemy or substitutable traits, that is accounted for on this axis. So products that can be easily gotten from someone else would not be high on the scale. They automatically drop down because if you can get them from somewhere else, then during the war and the switching is required, you pay the switching costs, but it's a one-time fixed cost, and then you can continue to produce whatever it is that you're using those products for domestically. So those products would automatically be shifted down anyway. On the relative gains question, a very important question. I spent a lot of time beating my head against a wall for this one. But technically speaking, both of these factors can be reversed for the enemy. So you could be concerned about your own conversion times, and you can be concerned about how much money your enemy is extracting from trade. Ultimately, what I came down on is you calculate relative gains in a very imbalanced way. You calculate your enemy's conversion time because you don't care how much they benefit from a particular trade. Because if they get even $1 million, but they only get that $1 million after the war is over, that's no longer your concern for this specific war. Because afterwards, what they do with those $1 million could be they can invest in their domestic economy. They can use it to fight someone else who you don't mind them fighting, right? So what they do with those gains, so long as it's after the war, you don't care. So that's why when you're looking at the enemy, you focus on conversion time. But when you're looking at yourself, you're focusing on revenue loss, because for yourself, you're mostly focusing on current survival and future security. Does that make sense?
Sure. Can I jump in on that one?
Yeah.
So, the bit that's missing from this is, to quote Keynes, how do you pay for the war? So where's the money story in this? Because if
Oh,
you read...
finance.
Right, exactly, but that's the thing. So revenue is a flow, debt is a stock. The way that you finance wars, particularly World War I and World War II, is you get a huge amount of debt from the Americans. So long as you have sort of like Banco de Yank, then in a sense your fiscal constraints for the duration of the war are very elastic. At which point, why should I care about revenue from actual trade? Because that would be a very small in proportion to what I can fund myself through debt.
Absolutely, 100%. But you're not only concerned about the fiscal stream for the war. This is the fiscal stream for long-term security. It's, will I be able to fund the war after this one?
Do you know that they're thinking that from the archives, though? Because when I'm looking at your stuff, it's like harnesses, right? Because we've got horses, so we know. No harnesses, right? Okay, no leather for harnesses. All right, no bolts for the leather for harnesses, right? That doesn't seem to be like, oh, the next war, right? We're going to go down that one. How do you make that claim stick?
You're absolutely right. So all of those were examples on the conversion time dimension. The examples on the revenue dimension are on the licenses. So they're actually, I don't know if I can extract enough evidence of this from other wars, but they're using different levers to do different policy stuff. So all of the prohibitions on trade are all along this dimension because it's a lot easier to control. On this dimension, they're using licenses to control them. So they prohibit all imports, and then they say, but I'll give you a license to this, and I'll give you a license to import this. And the product that they continued to import from Germany all through the war, and because they couldn't find a way to diversify, they still did it in World War II as well, hosiery needles.
Really?
So,
Hosiery needles.
Let me explain. We're not talking about knitting needles. We're talking about, if you've ever seen a knitting machine, the little needle that has an open hatch that you run the machine through that allows you to create textiles and to basically produce cloth. And in order to make each one of those hosiery needles, you needed very high precision measurement tools that only Germany possessed. So Germany was the only one who could make these things, and Britain needed it to make sure that their textile industry didn't go kaboom.
So even during World War II?
Even during World War II, even though they had the entire interwar period when they knew that they had this problem and they needed to figure out how to do something about it,
I'm just fascinated by this. So did a ship leave Hamburg under protection and was handed to British gunboats and it's like, here's your needles? Like, how do you get them?
Unfortunately, I don't have those details.
Wow.
Probably to the neutral countries, right?
It's got to,
Right,
got to
so-
be repackaged through Sweden.
Right.
It's got to be the Swedes. Yeah.
So all of the trade that we're talking about
Treacherous
is
bastards.
the trade we're talking about is indirectly through neutral states. And that's acknowledged in the prohibitions, because the way these prohibitions sound is not that you cannot export anything to Germany, it's you cannot export anything to countries that are west of the Mediterranean, I forget the exact name, it's like west of the Mediterranean, north of this point, like south of this point, which basically describes a square around Germany.
Right.
I'm not sure if it gets at something you've already said, but the revenue component you're explaining as a loss. But are there any moments, and I think that this goes to the illicit economies component of how, for example, looking at that gun point right there, what if there is a group that's illicitly selling weaponry to the other side, to the enemy state, and you see that you can actually make financial gains and increase your revenue by actually supplying those weapons because you know that they're going to have that regardless, but you can profit off of taxation or off of control or possibly delaying shipments if you actually have oversight into that process. Is that something that's like calculated into this or?
No, because again, I am very much focusing on the legal aspects of this, so what would the state want to trade with the enemy with? But I would also, the way that you phrased that particular question, I would say that my expectation would be that they wouldn't try to profit from that trade, they would try to sever as much of the illegal trade as they possibly can, because the same answer that I provided to you, if someone else is providing aspects to your enemy that are increasing their military capabilities, because of the war, because you want to win the war, because of battlefield outcomes, you want to prevent that from happening. So I don't expect that a state would pick up that kind of trade in order to make a buck, because I think they'd be too focused on surviving and winning the war. Yes?
A complicated question. Let me see if I can phrase this. This seems to be specifically from the home country perspective. We do a calculation of revenue and time, the vulnerability and so on, and simultaneously at a single product at a time. But in practice, there are some dynamics between the products, and while you can make decisions to prohibit exports, they can also make decisions to prohibit imports. So if you, for example, or what I would imagine could also be in this calculation is, you decide whether to prohibit an export of something, also depending on the tit-for-tat negotiation with the enemy on whether they will respond with a prohibition on importing another product that you have a much higher revenue sensitivity to. Is that in it, and how is that?
So fair point, right? So this is very much a monadic point of view, a state making its own calculations. The actual level of trade would be where these permissions on trade overlap with the enemy. So it could be possible that Britain allowed a specific product to be exported to Germany, and Germany prohibited the import of it. It's entirely plausible. I'm trying to put together a similar data set from the German point of view right now. I've finally found where the data exists. I might or might not need someone to translate all of the bizarre products, because some of them are, there's a lot of very bizarre chemical formulas that they call product. It gets complicated. But more to your question, there is no tit for tat in these there's no negotiations, there's no tit for tat. The Board of Trade attempted to look at it in that way at the very beginning of their considerations, and I might have it somewhere on here. Yeah, so they looked at the sugar trade specifically, and they said, well, there are the whole needles. So Germany exports sugar to us, and they need, I think it was wool from us. And because both of these are high portions of trade, we need to sort of make sure that the access continues. But they quickly realized that they can't actually prevail on Germany to make any kinds of decisions about this kind of stuff. And the only thing they have levers over is their own decisions. So it's not a tit-for-tat thing. It's a question of what am I willing to live with? And if what I'm willing to live with is what my enemy is willing to live with, then trade actually occurs. And because there's two different reasons for trading, a lot of overlap can actually exist because, one, most states start with the assumption that wars are going to be short, even if all of history has taught us that that's a horrendous assumption to start a war with. Nevertheless, we all start with the assumption that the war is going to be short, so a lot of trade is still possible and on the table, but also because of the other dimension, so what other countries decide is more important for them and what they want to protect and keep during the war could overlap with what you think it's also safe to trade in. Yes?
All right, we're probably running out of time, so.
Things keep going until they stop.
Okay. Just a couple things. One is, it seems that when push comes to shove, it's essentially kind of a fairly straightforward cost-benefit analysis. I'm wondering to what extent politics is kind of missing. So here you have unitary actors who are basically autonomous. So there's not a word in here about industry influence on politics or lobbying or why they might make an exception for this product because they're disproportionate political influence. So I'm just, are you basically saying, yes, it's not just focuses of the model, it's actually what you think happens, is that there's no influence from industry. And then second of all, towards the end of your talk, you said the expectation is you think that there'd be more trading with the enemy into the future. And I find myself wondering about that because you did put the scope conditions of a certain type of war. But the certain type of war that you described is actually dramatically on the decline overall. I mean, the kind of unitary two opposing forces that can make policies and going across the board, that's actually a decline in business as much as it doesn't seem so right at the moment. But the vast majority of conflicts are not of the type that you described. So that gets me to the last point, which is I can't tell, you go from making pretty general comments that seem to you think are universal to then the empirical illustrations, at least in the talk, I haven't seen the larger project, is World War I. So I'm just wondering, to what extent you really think this is a universal argument that would apply across time and place?
Fair question. So on the first point, I don't think that domestic politics has a large role to play in this, mainly, again, because in war, there's a very good argument for kicking domestic politics out of the process, and that's we're focusing on survival, we're focusing on winning here. I have a lot of World War I responses from the government to traders who sent in letters saying we would like some sort of protection, we would like to allow trade with the enemy, and the Brits are pretty good at their quick responses. Basically, we've got a war to fight here, come back in 4 years, something of the sort. But, so domestic politics can affect the process, but not in the way that you've proposed. They affect the process by providing information to the board making these decisions and allowing for the splitting of product descriptions. So I do see a lot of situations where Britain would prohibit the export of lead. Then someone writes into them and says, "What? Hold on, lead is a giant category. We have lead that we make these tea linings for. There's like no military utility here. We have lead that's actually used in weapons, but fine, we agree with that. We have this thing called white lead, which I forgot what it actually is at this point." And they describe the product differentiation, and then the government updates their policies, and they allow product exports on things that, based on their classifications, should be innocent, and they prohibit only the product descriptions that are more dangerous. My best example for this is actually from the Crimean War, not this one, from the 1854 Crimean War, where product descriptions got down to lead pipe of diameter between 1/2 and 3/4 inch depth. So domestic politics does come into the process, but not so much so as to knock products off of this list, but to provide information. On the second question of the kinds of wars we're fighting in the future, I hope you're right. Russia's proving us wrong. Everyone is concerned about whether or not there's going to be a ground war between the United States and China, which is terrifying to even consider. But again, so long as we can have a territory that trades, that makes wartime commercial policies, that's involved in a war, I would expect them to be able to follow this kind of model. So I do think it's universal so long as there is a territory that trades and is conducting a war.
Tony, you want back in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think now about what happens if the time horizon in Ukraine gets extended. And is the proper belligerent then Ukraine and Russia, or the West and Russia, and what does that do to the calculation?
So this is why I said that I don't think my theory as presented applies to the situation now in Ukraine, because the situation that everyone is thinking about is United States versus Russia. Well, the United States is a neutral state. Officially, sort of the distinction between belligerent and neutral considered, it's not and retaliate against European forces would make them a belligerent. Until then, they're not part of the conflict, so the war constraint is not particularly strong for them. And I need the war constraint to be fairly strong in order for the sort of the trade-off between security and military factors to start.
But isn't there, I mean, if the war becomes protracted, isn't there a calculation for Europe about the vulnerabilities that continued trade with Russia produce?
Absolutely. I just don't think it'll be this theory that'll explain the result.
One closing question on this then, because we have to bring it to an end. And please take home as much Indian food as you can possibly carry, because otherwise it's a bit of a waste. Thinking about Nicholas Mulder's book on sanctions, which is really a book about blockades, is it the case, in a sense, is the end of your graph a blockade? Like you go through all this stuff you ratchet it up, you ban more and more. And basically there's this trade-off, exactly the same, between expected intensity, which you always underestimate, and time, which you always underestimate. And as you get further out, then eventually what happens is you just do a blockade. And when you do a blockade, I mean, we could have a license, or I can, give Hayden certain components or whatever, but I'm never going to get them there. Right, they're just not going to happen, or you have to go through third parties, and then the cost becomes prohibitive, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just wondering, is there a kind of point where, like, when you get to like the middle of 1916 in World War I, when you have a full blockade, and then it's just game over?
So in World War I, all trade was actually cut off a month before the war ended.
Really? I thought it was earlier.
That a month before the war ended, that's when they decided this is so long that we're not going to bother with this anymore. This war will continue forever.
But was any of the trade getting through? I mean, it goes back to the point that was earlier. Like, the Brits get the needles by putting them on a boat and sending them to Stockholm and this sort of,
Right.
like, they can have it on the books, but is it actually going on once you get to a certain point?
So I don't have specific volume of trade data, but I do know that some of the trade is getting through by certain reports, and all this wartime trade that we're talking about is indirect trade. It has to go through intermediaries, which increases conversion time, but also makes the trade safer to actually get to your country.
Right.
Right. So it is all very much going through neutral states, but some of it is going through. And so less so for World War I, because some lovely historian decided that this information was not worth saving. I have a folder that says representative of all others, and all others have been destroyed because this is all that you need for posterity's sake. I have, though, evidence from World War II of products that were being imported to Britain from Germany, hosiery needles amongst them, a few raw materials every once in a while, of actual trade that's being government sanctioned and being imported in.
See, the commercial interest, you can never kill it. Thank you very much for a great talk.
Thank you very much. This was a lot of fun. Oh, yes, I need to. And I can see what was generally happening here because Ukraine map is on the desktop.